Our speaker today is Dr. Eric Thacker over with our Rangeland folks. And Dr. Thacker, why don't you take it away?
All right, thanks, Carrie. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So Carrie had asked me to give this little webinar after part of a presentation that I gave at the Beef Field Days. And so he came up with the title of Online Range Monitoring Point and Click. In reality, what I'm telling you is how you can look smarter than you, how you can be smarter than you look using some online tools that make it look like you've got rangelands figured out. So I've changed this a little bit just from some of the online monitoring to basically showcase some of the online tools that I use quite heavily with my extension, the range extension part of my job. So in the last few years, there's been some real exciting changes made and things made available. And today we're going to talk about a few different online applications and then one phone app that I use quite heavily. And they're actually really good tools, and they're coming along. And so the first one is the Rangeland Analysis Platform. We'll get to that in a minute. Google Earth, Utah Wildflowers, and Onyx Hunt. And I have legitimate reasons for using the Onyx Hunt, not just to support my recreational activities. The first one I wanted to talk about is the Rangeland Monitoring, and so it's called RAP, or the Range Analysis Platform. So this rolled out less than a year ago. I've mentioned it to some of you. This is a very powerful tool. Ironically, this rolled out just as we were trying to finish the monitoring guide, which I've also talked with a lot of you, and partially went home and felt like I was already a dinosaur, because this has potential to replace a lot of what we spent a lot of time talking about in the Rangeland Monitoring Guide. So when we think about rangeland monitoring, especially if we're talking public lands, you really can lump it into two categories. There's range trend. So that's what does the vegetation look like across time? How is it changing? That's the one that's very expensive and very hard to figure out. The other one that's a lot easier is your annual assessments. These are things like utilization, how much grass is left at the end of the season. Those are fairly easy to figure out. They're a lot easier to measure. They don't take a lot of expertise. Whereas if you're going to tackle rangeland trend, it takes, number one, a lot of years of data. Then number two, you have to have someone to help, or someone that's able to analyze the data, and then somebody to interpret the data. And so I've had a hard time thinking about how you convince landowners, number one, to do monitoring, especially when we're talking about things like rangeland trend. How do you make it quantifiable, meaning that you've got good hard numbers that stand up? And then on the flip side, where do they get the expertise that they need to analyze and kind of interpret that data? So this RAP, or Rangeland Analysis Platform, is literally all of that rolled into a point and click system. So it's basically, it's doing what a lot of people have talked about doing or thought about doing for quite some time. They've taken on the ground data, either from the NRCS NRI process, which is the National Range Inventory, or the BLM AIM, which is Assessment Inventory Monitoring Framework. And so between those, they have about 30,000 data points. And then with some aerial photos and imagery and some greenness indexes, NDVI, they've put together this new technology. So it's basically literally maps, and then on the ground. One of the things that, so Brady Allred, who's a colleague of mine from when I was at Oklahoma State, who is now at University of Montana, helped develop this. And this runs on the Google Earth engine, which is basically just some serious computing power. And so it literally takes all of this data, it makes these calculations across landscapes very quickly. And so you have this technology available to you at your fingertips. So one of the first things everybody asks is the accuracy. How accurate is it? So we all know, once we start talking about models, because this is a vegetation model or a model of vegetation, that there is inherent inaccuracies in all models. So it's not going to be perfect. It won't address every question. There will be places that it's weak. But by and large, so here's some mean absolute error. So this gives us an idea of how accurate the images are. And so you'll see with forbs and grasses, they figure they're about 7.8% or 8%, 11%, 7% for shrubs, about 5% for trees, and bare ground about 7%. So while those numbers may look a little bit high, if you actually look at data we collect on the ground, our error rates are probably in the ballpark of those same numbers. The hard part is a lot of times we don't know exactly what our error rates are when we do on the ground monitoring. So I was telling Carrie before everybody jumped on, that I was hoping this would be fairly informal, because I'm going to spend some time. In fact, I'm going to encourage you to pull this up on your computer while I'm talking so that you can kind of familiarize yourself with this. So if you just go to a Google search bar and type in Rangeland App, it'll pull you should be able to pull this page up, which is this range analysis platform. I see that Matt Palmer jumped on the call, so we'll zoom into a site that Matt and I have been working on to test it out first. So it covers basically all of the Western US. There's several parts to it. Go ahead, Carrie.
So do you have to use an app, or could you just type in the browser rangeland.app?
You can type in either one, Carrie. It's actually not an app that you're going to download. It's an online interface.
Got you. So I see up there in the browser bar, I see where it says Range.
Yeah. So if you look up, it just says Rangeland's app. So it's not an app like on your phone. This will be on your web browser.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the clarification there, Carrie. So if you launch this app, then for those of you that are kind of following along, it'll take you, and so there's a few different parts of this that'll kind of walk you through. I think this has a lot of application for a lot of what we do. So you can move this on the opacity here. You can determine how dark that layer is. I usually turn that down so I can see my base map. I'll turn the satellite imagery on so I can see what I'm talking about. And we'll start zooming in. So the first thing we'll look at, and we'll kind of look at the state scale, is we can change. There's several different categories, and this gives us cover across the area that we're looking at, just a kind of a continuous layer. So if we look at perennial grass cover from 0, where it's very light colored, to very dark, this gives us an idea of perennial cover. This would include things like perennial grasses, forbs, herbaceous perennial cover. So if we turn that on, again, you can see the drier areas of the state show up very light. That's because there's not very much perennial cover there. Other parts of the state, especially in the mountains, you see this very dark, which tells you we're approaching that 50% perennial grass cover. The other thing that I often do, just to eliminate any confusion, is if you look right down here, is I'll exclude croplands, development, and water. So that'll just take out areas where it's no longer natural or somewhat native vegetation that's developed. So there's several different categories. We can look at shrub cover, and this would include sagebrush, rabbitbrush, any type of shrubby cover. There's also annual cover. This is primarily cheatgrass, so this is one that I spend quite a bit of time looking at. So if we look out in West Box Elder County, let me zoom into something a little more specific. So here's Park Valley. So you'll notice south of Park Valley, we see quite a bit of cheatgrass in these areas. Again, the Promontory Mountains here, for example, these have burnt multiple times. You can see this awful high cheatgrass cover. You can do the same thing with tree cover. Again, this is really useful when you're talking about pinyon and juniper treatments, or even the cover of pinyon juniper or other trees. Again, you can see the different colors, light meaning not very many, dark meaning heavier cover. Let me close my email so it doesn't ding the whole time we're talking. Similarly, you can do the same thing with bare ground. And then also with this composite cover, which is just kind of, it's a composite of all the green is a perennial, the blues, the shrubs. One of the other really neat features is you can scale this across time. So we can look at annual grass cover in West Box Elder County in 1984. That's when things start, is in 1984. Now, if you push this play right here, then it'll animate, or it'll flip those images from 1984 to the present. So as you turn that on, you can watch this annual grass cover change over time. And so you can see some years it looks like there's more annual grass cover, other years it looks like there's less annual grass cover. So a lot of that would be driven by precipitation. And then you can stop it at any given year. So I'll stop it on 2003. 2003 I know is a dry year in West Box Elder, whereas 2004 and 2005 were wetter years in Box Elder County. So you can see the swing in that annual grass cover from 2003, which was a relatively dry year, to 2005, which was quite wet. In fact, in June of 2005, we had well over an inch in most of Box Elder County, which is quite a bit for that time of year. And so you can see the resulting changes in the annual grass cover across that time.
So I've got a question that came in, and it's from Kevin Heaton. Can this be used to compare year-to-year perennial grass cover? And I suspect that that's what you're illustrating now.
Yeah, so we can do this with any of these categories, Kevin. And so feel free to stop me if you want to just take your microphone off mute and interrupt me, that's fine. I want this to be fairly informal because I think this is a tool that a lot of the agents specifically can use that will really help them out in talking with producers or even just kind of getting a feel for what's happened. So here's that same area with a perennial grass cover. So we could go back and look at 2003. You can see that things were fairly light colored, whereas if we bump this ahead to 2005, then we see this very dark. So again, what this is reflecting is that the change in management across that entire block probably didn't change a whole lot from 2003 to 2005. But what did change is we come out of a really severe drought in 02 and 03, and then 04 and 05 were both above annual precip years. And so we're seeing the results in the grass cover. So a lot of times when we talk about things like allotment, these are very key pieces of information that can get lost as range cons cycle in and out, or our memory's not all that good, ironically, in remembering some of these events. And so you can go back and tie some of these to precipitation changes directly related to precipitation cover. Another one that's kind of interesting to look at is tree cover. And again, we'll kind of stay in West Box Elder right now. You know, if we roll this back all the way to 84, because again, most of what you're looking at here is perennial, or is pinyon juniper, primarily juniper. So just watch the colors change as we roll this forward. You'll see over time, you can see the darkening around these mountains, which is again indicating that we've got increases, or we're increasing in juniper cover over time. We'll speed this up a little bit just for the sake of time. So again, this gives us some broad scale idea of what's happened over time. So we could also zoom down to the southern part of the state here in an area where Kevin and I have a project down here on Escalante, south of Escalante. We're basically working out on kind of this area right here.
So I saw that one of the questions is we can run that year to year. You kind of show that change. Is there any way to quantify that? And I think you're going to get to that later.
Yeah, I'll get to that in just a minute. So these are all great, right? But these are pictures. So we can look at perennial grass cover across this mountain. The one thing you'll notice is that if we look at annual cover here, we're not going to have much annual cover in this part of the state. And largely that's because we don't have a lot of cheatgrass. There's some showing up. But getting to that point, so this just gives us kind of a visual of what's happening. Now, if we want to get to the quantify, where we're actually quantifying things, there's another feature that we'll use. So in this same area, we can, let me turn this off right now. You click on the draw feature. So what this allows you to do is digitize an area. You're going to set an area that you want the tool to focus on. So I'm just going to focus on this area right here. Now, this is supposed to work at a 30-meter pixel, meaning the smallest pixel size is 30 meters by 30 meters. It should be pointed out that the smaller piece of land you look at, the more inaccuracy that you may end up having, because as it makes inferences across all of those pixels, you can increase some error. So just keep that in mind. Now, once you've delineated your area, you can click on this Calculate Time Series. So this is where I've spent an awful lot of my time playing with this tool. You look right down here on your left, you can see this little graph that shows up, and then you can click on that to expand it. So what this gives us is this gives us a continuous look at cover over time. So in this part of the state, we have a lot of bare ground. So this is bare ground cover, this orange line that's on top. You can see we're fluctuating from 54%. You know, you've got 52 in 1984 and 54 in 2018. So overall, our bare ground is fairly stable. So what that means is that our management is not led in this area to increases in bare ground, meaning we're maintaining our vegetative cover, which is really important. That's one of the key elements that they look for in rangeland trend, is that you're keeping vegetative cover on the land and therefore protecting the soil. Now, if you look down here towards the bottom of the graph, there's different lines for the different functional groups. We've got annual forbs and grasses, which is this line right here. So you're seeing it's bouncing from about 6%, from 1% to 6%. You'll notice that it fluctuates over time, like you would expect. You'll see that it often will coincide with your perennial grass cover. And we've got perennial grass cover that's bounced around from 10% as high as 13%, but all back to about 10%. Looks like the low here is about 7. So in reality, what this tells us is this landscape is very stable. This landscape right here, in fact, this area that we're in right now is grazed currently. It's where we have a project going that Kevin has put together. And so what that gives us is this gives us an indication that that area is pretty stable, meaning that the grazing has not led to a decline of perennial grasses. It's not necessarily led to an increase in cheatgrass. So this gives us some confidence that we're fairly stable, or that our vegetation is fairly stable on that, in this particular grazing allotment. You can also look at tree cover. Here's our perennial grass. Tree cover comes in down here. And basically, you've just got a few trees scattered around that landscape. So this, to me, is one of the really powerful tools for this. If you want the actual numbers, if you look over here, there's 3 different icons. You can click on a CSV Excel, meaning it'll import this into an Excel file. And then you have the actual data. Now, a question that I've got for the folks that have developed this is, we would like to use it for some of the research we're doing in northern Utah, and I want the standard errors around these means. And so I've got to call them to see if we can get that, because the application is not providing those. But again, if you have a piece of land that a landowner is wondering what's happened over time with the vegetation, this is an incredibly easy way to get that piece of information. This information that we just flashed up on the screen here is literally worth tens of thousands of dollars if you looked at what it would take to collect that data annually across an area of land like that from 1984 to 2018, then to have that data in a format that you could analyze it and then interpret that data, it's quite a valuable piece. The other piece to this that becomes quite helpful is if you click on the annual precip right here on the end, then it will actually overlay your precipitation over the top of your vegetation. So one of the things that has stood out to me a lot as I've looked at a lot of areas around the state with this precipitation is I want everybody to note that there's really not anything that resembles normal precipitation in that entire graph. we're swinging from 5 inches all the way up to over 10 inches. So back in 15, we were at 14 inches. And so you can see the resulting change in some of the vegetation here based upon those swings in precipitation. So the other thing I think this really helps demonstrate is that we live in a highly variable system. And so, you know, your average would be somewhere through the middle here, meaning there's not many years that really fall on the average. What we really end up with are years that are above average and years that are below average. Again, I think this is a very powerful piece of information. As researchers, we collect this data and we can look at this information, but this is now available basically to anybody that has internet access. So one of the things that I've spent some time looking at, and I haven't looked at this before, is looking at treatments or fires. So I'm going to see if I can zoom in to a project that Matt Palmer and I have worked on, the fuel breaks up above Mount Pleasant. Get my
Go a little further south.
That's right.
It's right there.
There we are. Okay, thank you, Matt. Okay, so you can clearly see the fuel breaks that have been established. This is the Scout Camp Mount Teefee, and then there's a bunch of cabins over here. These fuel breaks were established to protect basically the Scout Camp and the resulting cabins in the area. You can see those have been established, and then the project that Matt and I have been working on is we've had, well, Matt, it's the collective we. Matt does the work, and I just show up once in a while to make it look like I've done something important. But Matt, the grazing has been established in these to maintain these fuel breaks. And so one of the things that Matt and I have struggled with is finding the funding and the things that we need to do the monitoring. And I haven't done this before this, so this is our first run to see if we can use this to monitor these sites. Mostly we know when the treatments went in, and so we can look at what this might look like over time. Okay, so first thing you'll notice is this orange line. I get it to hover just right. So this is shrub cover. So this would include some of the vegetation that was removed. So Matt, when did those treatments go in? According to our vegetation data, it would be around 2011, 2012. Matt, did you hear me?
Matt, you may need to unmute.
Yeah, you're muted.
I didn't know you were looking for a response. Yeah, I think about that time.
So you can see that, well, the obvious is you see the reduction in the tree cover in that area, and then you see the resulting increase in the grass cover. Now, there was some seeding done as well, but primarily you can see the impact of those treatments. Again, the blue, we've got shrub, and then the orange line here is the tree cover. So it reduced the shrub and tree cover from 34% and 32% down here to 13% and 18%. So we can see the impact of those treatments following, or the changes in vegetation following those treatments. Now, whether this is sensitive enough to get at all of the answers that to the questions that Matt and I have asked is another question. While this tool has a lot of advantages, the disadvantages are that it's just giving us some pretty coarse vegetation cover outcomes. We can't look at species. We can't look at a lot of the other things that we might look at, species diversity. Did our seed mix come? Because we can't look at species level, and we can't even separate forbs and grasses. So this is just forb and grass cover is in that perennial category. And then obviously the shrubs, bare ground, etc.
And the tree and the bare ground, I mean, that tree probably and the shrub is the biggest thing we're looking for, and it looks like it may tease that out. You know?
Yeah. No, for some of the questions we have, Matt, I think this will work because you're exactly right. We'll be able to see whether we're maintaining or keeping trees and shrubs out of that fuel break with the grazing that we have currently in place. So anyway, so that's just one example of where it could be applied. The other place that I've spent quite a bit of time looking at it are in areas where we've had burns. I'm going to come back up to northern Utah to an area that's burnt several times. This area right south of, so the Park Valley's right over here. This is what was the town of Kelton. So there's been a fairly large area that's burned out in here, and in a minute I'll show you where you can easily figure that out. So you could zoom in and you can even see treatment lines in some of this landscape where things have been treated. Again, we can draw some features across or digitize across that landscape. Let me clear that, I've got it all. So I want everybody that's got a window available, I want you to pull up the app and I want you to mess around with this a little bit. I want you to go to a place that you're familiar with, and then try this. Digitize an area.
So to refresh our memory, he's at Rangeland. Let's see, it's rangelands.app. That's where you need to go.
Eric, this is Trent. Hey, you may have got into it and I missed it or something, but how exactly are the images created? How are they getting that?
So what they've done, Trent, is they've got Landsat imagery, which are basically just very detailed, aerial photos. And what they've done is they've taken those photos and then using some fancy math and modeling, they're able to relate the vegetation data collected on the ground at specific points, and then use that vegetation data to then classify the image. So basically, they use that data we know what that pixel looks like, so we relate what that pixel looks like in a photo to other pixels, and then they extrapolate that data from the ground points across the landscape. So it's basically just scaling up vegetation data from the ground level using remote sensed imagery.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Trent?
Yeah. Yep. Thanks.
So has everybody tried this or got something pulled up? So the question I'm going to ask you, does it make sense? When you look at that, does it make sense? Does it look like what your experience has been on the ground?
So Eric, I pulled up a spot that burned out up west of town. I think it was 2017, just to see that, and that's what we're seeing. Lots of bare ground, reduction in all vegetative types. So I guess that's what we would expect to see in a place where we'd had a fire. And
so, Boyd, I think you bring up a good point, because I think one of the values of this is often when I meet with landowners or agents or even the agencies, they'll have some idea of what happened to this piece of ground, and they might even have an idea of what happened to the vegetation over time. They've implemented a treatment, they see less cheatgrass, but we're not able to quantify that because we can't go back in time. This tool now allows us to be able to go back in time and reconstruct that from in a quantifiable way. And I think that's one of the real powers of this type of a tool. How about anybody else? Anybody else want to share their experience of what they've looked at?
Do you know who the owner is of this?
So if you go to the main page, the NRCS, the BLM have largely funded it. The Sage Grouse Initiative has kind of been the driving force behind this.
Okay.
And the beauty of it is they've just made it free to anybody that has an internet address or that can get online.
Okay, thank you.
So Dusty, I understood your question to ask, can you tell who owns the land you're drawing on? Is that what?
No, actually, no, it was, no, I was right, but then you would have to go cross-reference to the ownership map.
And I'll talk about that in just a second. That's one of the other things I want to talk about.
Okay, I wanted to make sure Dusty was understood. I misunderstood.
So I have in my county, Greg Simons is in my county. So
yes,
my friend. So that, you know, it's a little competitive thing there. So that's why I was wondering. Anyway, we're buddies.
Yep. So no, this is similar to what Greg has been doing for the last about 10 years. He's been working on this.
Yeah.
It's very similar in, well, it's a different approach to the same answer. How's that? So
it's free.
And it's free.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so does anybody else have any questions on this? If not, then I'm going to move on to some other tools that I use quite often.
Yeah, one came in. Can you predict? Obviously, you're saying that's above or below average, but can you do anything to sort of like predict what the next year's grazing would be? That would be a little more difficult because you don't know precip, right?
No. So now you're stretching, right? So there's an effort afoot to actually do that. I'm working with some folks not only here, but University of Arizona, University of Colorado, where they're attempting to look at some modeled layers like you're looking at that look at net primary production or above ground biomass production, relating that to precipitation to see if they can create some way of predicting forage production. Now, that sounds an awful lot like a divining rod or something like that, and it's pretty close. But part of what we're looking at is it would be a probabilistic approach, meaning by April 15th, if you were still 60% of normal precipitation-wise, it would help provide some educated guesses as to what your forage production would be for the year, so you can make a decision on, do I need to sell? Do I need to buy more hay? Along those lines. But we're not there with what we've got currently available to us. That's a good question, though. But you certainly can look back and look at how that's changed over time. And again, this isn't related to, you can't relate vegetative cover to biomass production or to forage production. So this just tells you how much of the land surface is covered by perennial grasses, which doesn't really, it's related to forage production, but it's not exactly the same. So we're still kind of a step away from getting to something like that.
So Eric, my question is, what metrics determine whether or not it's tree cover versus shrub cover? And the reason I asked that, you asked us to take an area that we knew, and I put some areas around Panguitch that I knew had been bullhogged and reseeded and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so recently it looks like there's a pretty downward trend in tree cover. But if I go back to 1990, saying there was 10% tree cover, which is like there's a big low point in the graph. And 5 years later, there's 35% tree cover. And so there's got to be some errors in there, because those are definitely some outlier cases. What's the basis for the error?
So the basis for the error is probably due to the imagery. As you can imagine, teasing apart a juniper tree that's 6.5 feet tall versus a sagebrush that's 3 feet tall becomes difficult. And so you can have some associated error just even based on the quality of the image, Kevin. So you will inherently find areas that this may not work as well as it does in other areas. The other thing that's really important to remember is when you digitize an area, it'll include everything in that. So I've noticed sometimes when I digitize, if I look at a treatment, but I catch edges of juniper, of the edges of the treatment, then you can include tree cover that you may not have intended to include as well. But and they've admittedly so, separating tree cover and shrub cover can be kind of difficult. And so I've heard others, I haven't found them, but I've heard of others that have had problems where it suggested that there were trees present where there wasn't. And so again, this is our best guess at what we've got right now. The cool part is as new data comes in, this actually updates annually as more vegetation data comes in. And so in theory, over time, it will get better, each year as they add more data to the models. Bottom line, Kevin, is you still need some ground reference to use as kind of a sniff test to make sure that what you're seeing in the data is real.
So Eric, I'm sensitive of your time, and I just, as moderator here, want to see it's about 12:40. I know you had another point or two you wanted to bring out, and then
Yep.
of course it's your session, whatever you want to do. But
yeah, so there's a couple others that I think we can cover pretty quickly, and then if we have other questions, we can come back or email me or text me if you have questions about the Rangeland app, and maybe we can do some follow-up if we need to. I want you to think about whether this is something that would be useful for producers. I think it has a lot of merit for producers, and it would be fairly easy, but think about that, whether this could be included into some sort of county level programming in your counties. So one of the other apps that I want to bring up real quick, and this one is one that I've used surprisingly more and more over time. I didn't download it with the thought of using it for work, but I actually use it for work more than I use it for recreational activities. So this is called Onyx Maps. It was developed by a company for basically hunters to help them identify, private lands, public lands. So this is where I use it quite heavily with work related. So I can turn on different layers. I've got government lands lit up right now in Utah, private lands. So as I zoom in, I'm actually seeing land ownership across that landscape. And so I found this extremely helpful when I'm out on the ground with producers or, again, land management agencies, because I can get the context of what we're talking about in terms of how big the parcel is. You can click on it. So this is a parcel owned by the Kunzlers. So that parcel is 6,900 acres. And it works the same way with the BLM. You can click on a particular area and it'll give you the acres that's encompassed in that polygon. Again, where I've found it extremely helpful and useful is when I'm out on the ground. If I'm visiting with a particular landowner, I can actually see the extent of their property. I can zoom in, it labels springs, it labels roads. One of the other things that's really helpful is you can use it just like a GPS. It actually is just a GPS. You can add waypoints, you can use line distance and even area shape. And so this is one of those that I joke makes me look a lot smarter than I am, because recently on a range visit, we were discussing with a livestock producer in the BLM about whether there was enough forage to sustain cattle into the coming summer months. We identified a part of the allotment that it appeared that there was enough forage there, but we'd have to work on holding them to that. The advantage to me is I didn't have to guess acreage. I could actually go in on my phone, digitize the area that we were talking about. Then I was able to make a guess as how much forage was in that on a per acre basis. And then I've got mine set to meters right now, so it's giving you square kilometers. But then I was able to actually give a much better guess or estimate of how much forage was left in that pasture, and then predict how many days the producer would be able to stay. So again, it's a tool that I've used quite a bit. In fact, I don't carry a GPS anymore, simply because this is really good. The other advantage to this tool is that you can you can save and download maps. So if you're in areas where you know you're not going to have cell service, you can save an area. It'll download it to your phone permanently, so that when you're out on the ground, even if you don't have the internet access, you can still pull the map up, look at land ownership, create waypoints, navigate your waypoints, all of those things. So again, I think it's a tool that that's quite helpful. I use it quite a bit, especially when I'm working with landowners. Okay, so real quick, the last one I wanted to bring, kind of bring to the forefront of everybody's mind is this. It's called Utah Wildflowers. So it's a plant identification app. So it covers the state fairly well. One of the beauties of this app, it was a little disappointing actually when I found the app, because I'd started putting pieces together to do this with some of the work that Roger Banner done with the grass and grass-like guide, that field guide that we've got, and to put it into some sort of an app, and then realized that we'd been beat to the punch. But it allows you to select habitat types. It allows you to select functional group or what type of vegetation, the color of the flowers, the orientation of the flowers, and the leaves. And so just to kind of roll through an example, so without any sort of, it's showing over 3,000 plants for the state of Utah. So the first thing you can do is you can click on this time and place tab within the app, and then it allows you to basically point and click. So I just chose a spot in Garfield County, somewhat close to where some of our work's going on. You can even identify the time of year it is and the elevation that you're at. And then you see that now we've now reduced that 3,000 plants down to 951. So it's kind of narrowing down the potential plants that we're looking at. So from there, you can choose, I just randomly chose a yellow flower with 5 petals. So that cut us down to 18 plants. And then you can go over here to the results, and then you can scroll through results. Actually, I didn't choose yellow, I chose red. So, oh, whoops. So then what it does, it makes it so you don't have to scroll through pages and pages of different plants to identify the flower that you're looking at. So one that would be quite prevalent in that area is this Sphaerosia or globe mallow. So it's a very easy to use plant guide that's pretty good. My field crews have been using this in the field as they're doing monitoring for the last couple of years, and have had really good success. Now, like everything else, it's not going to capture everything. There's going to be some species that fall outside of this or that don't fit, and you'll have to seek help from somebody else. But it's a really good app that's pretty good. And again, it works without data, so you can use this in the field. That data is all stored on your phone. Just another quick example, start at the 3,000 plants. This time we chose shrub, yellow. We're in that same area of Garfield County. And then we chose desert this time. So immediately it's already pared us down to 26 plants. Then within that, this was the one that I was actually had in mind when I went through that, was this Mexican cliff rose, which there's quite a lot of that in that part of the county. So again, it gives you 26 plants that you then have to scroll through to help you identify which plant it is you're talking about. So again, I think this is a very useful app. It's available both for the Android system and for the Apple operating systems. It's free, it doesn't cost anything. So it's a pretty good tool. Again, I use this quite a bit in the field just because it gives me a pretty good plant guide on my phone. It's just unfortunate that that extension, we didn't beat them to this, but it is what it is. The last tool I want to touch on, again, I think it's one that a lot of you are probably familiar with. There have been some changes recently, and that's Google Earth. I'm sure most of you use Google Earth. However, if you download Google Earth Pro, which is free, it used to cost like 50 bucks. It's free now. It allows you to add layers, which that was a feature that was not available in the past. And so what you're looking at right here is this is all of the BLM allotments in the entire state of Utah. So again, this is one I use a lot. You'll have a producer or an agent or even federal agency folks call, and they'll want to talk about an allotment. And this allows me to zoom in to identify the allotment. So this is Lake Canyon. It'll give you the acres Unfortunately, it would be great if it would give stalking rates and on and off dates, but it does not do that. But again, it gives you a really good idea of, it'll give you the size of the allotment and its orientation on the landscape. I have layers for both the BLM and the Forest Service. So if you're interested in those layers, I will send them to you. I will warn you, if you're using an older computer, this one that I'm using is about 5 years old. It's slow. It takes me a little bit to load my Google Earth now because of the layers I've added. If I speed up my RAM, it would solve that problem. But again, being able to look at a photo, you can do some of the same things that I use Onyx Map for, where I can look at distances. Google Earth shows the terrain a lot better, which is helpful for a lot of things because you can tip it up. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Google Earth, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But,
so Eric, you can take that allotment number then. How do you determine who's grazing on that allotment?
So it's not
the office or?
Yeah, so for the most part, I use this one. I've got a producer on the phone and they say, you know, I've got some questions about my allotment. What allotment are you grazing? And then I'll use it to identify the allotment. And then for me, it just gives me a way that I can familiarize myself with an allotment without being on the ground, you know, as I prepare for a site visit or something like that. Again, there's just an awful lot you can do just knowing where they're at. And then, you know, looking at where water's distributed, how far, you know, how big it is, how many roads are there, those types of things. So those are the 4 apps, though, that I use the most with Rangeland Extension. The recent one being the Rangeland app, the vegetation stuff. Just kind of another shameless promotional plug. We're using some of these tools to develop a system to inform sagebrush treatments. That's been a fairly controversial topic in the state, those of you familiar with sagebrush. And so in order to make the decisions of whether sagebrush treatment should occur or shouldn't occur more transparent and to help with that conversation, we're taking some of these tools, which will then also help inform decisions on where treatments are appropriate, especially in light of sage-grouse type issues. I think that's pretty much it, unless there's any questions.